something beside me, a light to the kerosene, and the places aren't real anymore, and the faces don't say anything, in the silent light of the mind-blown sphere. It's a game, Devil's Chess Club. Devil's Chess Club.
Welcome to Devil's Chess Club. I'm Aaron Good, and I'm excited today that we have a special episode featuring Gary Vogler and retired U.S. Army Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, who wrote the foreword to Gary Vogler's book. We're going to be discussing that excellent book today. It is entitled Israel, Winner of the 2003 Iraq Oil War, Undue Influence, Deceptions, and the Neocon Energy Agenda. As I said, Colonel Wilkerson did write the foreword to this book, and he put me in touch with Gary Vogler. I can't think of two better Iraq War insiders that we could be discussing these issues with, and viewers may want to go back and watch two previous episodes that we did, starting a few episodes back, on Gary Vogler's book. Devil's Chess Club is part of the American Exception podcast. If you want to see the episode in its entirety, and if you want access to, in my biased opinion, the best podcast collection of deep political and historical analysis, please subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. The URL is patreon.com/American Exception. A link is in the show notes, and if you can afford it, please do subscribe. The more subscribers we have, the more we can do. We have a number of things in the works, including a documentary based on my dissertation/book, American Exception Empire in the Deep State. That's close to being done, I'm told. We're also trying to make a documentary film on the life and scholarship of Professor Peter Dale Scott. And we're working on finishing up a new volume of Peter Dale Scott essays, which also include essays it co-authored by me and by Ben Howard, who is best known for his many TrueAnon appearances. We need help to do this, so please subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. I am here today with Gary Vogler and Lawrence Wilkerson. Some of you all would remember Gary Vogler as the author of this book on the here it is. Here are his two books, Iraq and the Politics of Oil, An Insider's Perspective, and the one that I covered in detail, Israel, Winner of the 2003 Iraq Oil War. Also with us is Lawrence Wilkerson, who wrote the foreword to Israel, Winner of the Oil War in Iraq. And this is, I'm really excited to have you all together. Gary Vogler, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. And thank you to Larry for joining us. Larry's been a key advisor and I've gotten to know Larry quite well in the last, 6-7 years since we both went on the Rachel Maddow show back in 2014. And we argued an issue on the opposite ends, and I realized after that he was right and I was wrong. So my two books cover that. Did you want me to start with the...
Well, that's funny that you mentioned that, because I was going to, I guess my first question, also, Larry, it's great to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you.
My first question is... for you, Gary Vogler, can you tell us about your background in the military and oil industry and your positions vis-a-vis Iraq before and after the invasion, just to give people a sense of who you are in case they missed the book review episodes?
Sure, be happy. I went to West Point, graduated in 1973, spent a few years at Fort Bragg in an airborne unit, and in Germany, before getting out of the Army and joining Mobil Oil Corporation in Texas. Spent some time in Texas and then to Saudi Arabia for 4.5 years, came back to the corporate headquarters here in Fairfax, Virginia, until 2002. Exxon bought us in 1999, and I was one of the last mobile executives to leave the corporation under the old golden parachute, if you will. I left in February 2002. I did nothing for 6 or 7 months, and then I got a call from my Army Reserve unit. Even though I got out of the Army in 1981, I stayed in the Army Reserves. And I got a call from my Army Reserve unit, the U.S. Corps of Engineers in D.C., and they asked me to go to the Pentagon and interview for a job in OSD. And I said, yeah, I'd be happy to. They said it was a short job, only a couple of months. And I said, I had one question. And they said, what's that? And I said, what's OSD? I quickly learned that it was the Office of the Secretary of Defense for Policy under Doug Feith. And I went over there in October 2002, interviewed, started work the next day because we were putting together a pre-war oil planning cell for what was the Iraq War. And there were people being assigned to that cell from throughout the government. It was an interagency planning cell. We had a person from the State Department. She had worked in the Near East Asia Bureau for over 10 years. We had a highly qualified individual from the Department of Energy who had been an Army officer, a major during the first Gulf War. We had a guy from the CIA, and it was a good planning team. And then we morphed into a team that joined Jay Garner as we went into Iraq. When we got out into Iraq, I was the senior oil advisor, first guy to enter the Ministry of Oil headquarters, first civilian to enter the Ministry of Oil headquarters. And in fact, I was, for my first 10 days in Iraq, I was the Minister of Oil. And then on May 3rd, 2003, I appointed a gentleman by the name of Thamer Gadban to be essentially the Iraqi Minister of Oil. And then I stayed in Iraq throughout the CPA, the Coalition Provisional Authority, until 2004, July 2004. I took a couple years off. I was mentally and physically exhausted at that point. And then I went back for 5 years as a contractor working for the U.S. forces as their senior oil consultant there in Baghdad. And I stayed until the end of 2011. And since then, I've been back in retirement.
Well, you've been productive in your retirement writing these illuminating books. I confess I've only read part of the first book, but the second one, as my viewers know, I spent 2 episodes really kind of meticulously summarizing and responding to. Now, your position changed over the years, and Larry, can you reflect on your earlier meetings with Gary and the disagreements that you had about the Iraq War?
It wasn't a violent disagreement. There were a lot of things that were happening. And since I was teaching it as a case study at William and Mary and some really good students, and also at the George Washington University to equally good students, all in the honors program, had to maintain I think it was 3.75 GPA through 3 years just to get into the program. Talented students, and they all came to the same conclusion, that there were at least half a dozen, if not more, reasons that we went to war in Iraq, and none of them made a whole lot of sense except to the individuals who were pushing those particular reasons. And they ranged the gamut from anger of the president at an attempt to kill his father by Saddam Hussein to oil. But the one that permeated all the reasons, and that all my students would nod their head at, and say, yeah, that had something to do with the decision to go to war, oil. That was the one that sort of went through them all. And so I had this background of more than 400 students on 2 campuses doing really rigorous case study analysis and then presenting it to the rest of the seminar. And the last hour of that session was the seminar taking them apart, trying to find holes in their analysis to back me up in terms of all the reasons that we probably went to war. But the overriding reason, and Dennis Fritz, the other author we referred to, or maybe Gary, might disagree with this a bit, was the inexperienced president. So that all these different entities, to include Israel and Mossad, could play on him. They played on him through the Stradivarius, Dick Cheney and his crew. And so I have a hard time, as I used to tell Powell, blaming the President of the United States other than for being stupid. Not stupid in the sense of being dumb. He wasn't a dumb man. He was a pretty smart man. But he was stupid in the sense that he let the vice president lead him around for 4 years like a bull with a ring in his nose. And that was very frustrating for my boss, too. But that's what I had come to the conclusion of. Man, there was a lot of reasons for our having gone to war, none of which made sense in the collective field of national security, but each of which made sense for these poisonous individuals who were pushing the reasons.
Right, and you and Gary met on. Had you met with the Rachel Maddow documentary? What was the difference in interpretation of the Iraq War back in that time?
Well, I'll let Gary explain that.
Okay, very good.
Well, yeah, the way they did that documentary is I was interviewed in the summer of 2013. I think it aired in March of 2014. I don't know when Larry was interviewed, but I got a call from. I didn't want to go on. But I got a call from Ambassador Bremer. He said, Gary, come on, you got to go with me. You know, there are people that are saying that it was all about oil. And I said, sir, I don't want to go on there. You know, I'm kind of a camera shy type of guy. He said, no, you got, I said, sir, if you want me to, I will. So I went on. My position was, and it had been up until that point and a year after that there was no oil agenda to that war. I believed Feith and Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld when they said that there was no oil agenda. Actually, you know, I was naive. I believed those guys. So when we went on this thing, I went on. I said, hey, I couldn't find an oil agenda to the war. But in my and what I was thinking about was an agenda that the press was talking about, where Bush and Cheney were talking to senior oil executives in the U.S. oil industry. You know, and I would tell people, and I told people from the Wall Street Journal back in 2003, I said, hey, ExxonMobil had nothing to do with my appointment to this position I'm in. In fact, they didn't even know about it until I was in Kuwait, and there was an article written by Chip Cummins of the Wall Street Journal, and they all sent me emails saying, Gary, what are you doing? You're crazy being over there. But anyway, for the next 5 or 6 or 7 years, I denied the fact that there was any oil agenda at a low altitude like that, where it was actually deals being made between the administration and senior and oil executives. So I was at a very low altitude looking at things. I think Larry was looking at a very high altitude at a strategic level and the importance of oil to Iraq and to the world. And so when we went on the Rachel Maddow show, you know, I took the position that there was no oil agenda. Now, one thing I did do when I went on the Rachel Maddow show, I did some research and I threw out the question to them. It was a 3-hour interview, and they kept pinging me. They said, there's got to be some agenda. I said, the only thing that might be out there, and I said, I've just come across this here recently, is this Kirkuk to Haifa pipeline. I said, if there's anything you should be investigating, it should be that, if you're really looking for an oil agenda. And well, they totally dismissed that. They didn't want to go after that.
Did they include it in the documentary?
They did not include it in the documentary. I called and complained to them about censoring that out. And what they did is they put an outtake in their website of me telling the story about the Haifa pipeline. And that's the only thing they did for me.
Wow. Yeah, that's an important aspect of this. And maybe this is a time to ask this. I think as good as any. Where has Israel gotten its oil over the years? I think that your book lays this out and really explains this in a way that it's very clarifying to me. So maybe you could summarize this, because it's really amazing.
Yeah, energy security for Israel has been extremely important to both Israel and the United States since you go back to the 1960s. Back then, the Shah of Iran was the main supplier of oil to Israel. In fact, they came to an agreement to, and they kept it very confidential. The agreement was very, very secretive. That they would build a pipeline from Eilat, Israel, to Ashkelon, Israel, about a 42-inch pipeline that would carry about 1 million barrels a day, could carry 1 million barrels a day. And it was known as the Eilat Ashkelon Pipeline Company, EAPC. And that was constructed in 1969, 1970. And that was the main supplier of Israel's oil from 1970 until essentially 1995. There was a brief interruption in 1979 because of the revolution, but a gentleman by the name of Mark Rich, who was the key broker in a lot of this oil that came out of Iran and went to Israel, he was the one that kept that oil flowing, even at a time when, during the revolution, when things were in turmoil. Israel essentially confiscated the pipeline after that and kept it open for their own use. And so
they never paid Iran for that.
No, they never paid. In fact, there was a arbitration case probably 6-7 years ago now that said they owed Iran over $1 billion for that pipeline, but Iran's never going to be able to get that money. Iran was the primary source of oil, and in fact, Mark Rich supplied as much as 90% of Israel's oil until about beginning of 1995. His company, Mark Rich AG, was a brokerage company located in Switzerland. Even though he was an American, his company dealt with all these countries that the U.S. had sanctions with. In fact, every time the U.S. would levy sanctions against a new country, he saw it as an opportunity to make more money, and he did. He capitalized on it, so he did business with Iran, Cuba, Angola, all the countries that the U.S. levied sanctions with. But when Mark got a little bit greedy, and he got off into other commodities besides oil, and he tried to corner, I think it was the zinc market in the early 1990s, and he lost his shirt, lost close to 200 million, I think. So he had to sell out his interest in Mark Rich AG, and several investors from London and elsewhere came in to bail out the company. They renamed it to Glencore Commodities, which is still in existence today. But it's essentially everyone that worked for Mark back before 1995 worked for Glencore. And then there's another company out there called Trafigura. And Trafigura is just a twin of Glencore. It had broken away from Mark in the earlier 1990s, I think 1992, but they do essentially the same thing. Both of those companies are primarily Israeli. Glencore is a publicly traded company today, which gives them a lot of flexibility in the capital markets to do a lot of things that they were not able to do when it was a privately held company. But the Glencore, after 1995, they lost access to Iranian crude oil. So they went out to try to get crude oil wherever they could. And the places they got it were primarily Russia. But what Israel found is that they were paying a 25% premium for their crude oil after 1995 versus what they paid before that. And so there was a huge incentive to take, they had essentially lost their energy security at that point because they were getting oil from anywhere they could get it at the lowest price they could get it. And Glencore and Trafigura played key roles in that operation. And then Well, during the oil for food program, Glencore would get some oil from Iraq, but as you had mentioned a little bit before, they were part of the brokers that paid a nice premium. What's the bribe?
Yeah, there you go. Bribe, right.
Yeah, so that happened until October of 2003, when we went in to Iraq. You know, what I learned years later was that when we set up the oil ministry, and we worked with the Iraqis on who they would sell their oil to. A gentleman by the name of Phil Carroll that I mentioned in the book was the retired CEO from Shell US and a retired chairman from Fluor. He and I and a gentleman by the name of Mohammed Al-Jabouri, we came to the decision, along with Ambassador Bremer, that we would only sell Iraqi crude while the U.S. was there to large companies that had refineries. And that way they would minimize the potential of corruption. And Mohammed Al-Jabouri was 100% behind that decision. He was a strong supporter of that because he saw all the corruption that was taking place before we entered Iraq, and saw how it was impacting the Ministry of Oil and specifically his marketing organization. And so he supported that policy. And then when Ahmed Chalabi, I may be getting ahead of myself in the story, but Ahmed Chalabi was appointed as the head of the governing council in, I think it was August, September of 2003. And Ahmed was key in appointing the new oil minister. And the new oil minister was part of Ahmed's team. Well, Ahmed had made a promise to the Israel lobby in the United States that he would get oil to Israel before the end of 2003. And in his first plan, the first plan was that they would reopen an old pipeline that was built in 1934. It was called the Kirkuk to Haifa pipeline. That pipeline was a small pipeline built in 1934. It was the first export pipeline out of Iraq. And it operated from 1934 until 1948. And it was operated
just to interrupt here for 1 second. People can see it on this map. It's the middle one, and it goes through Homs to this Lebanese. It says it looks Syrian, but is it in Syria or Lebanon where it exits on the coast? I thought it was Lebanon, but from memory, but it looks, you can't really tell on the map here. But the point is, you can see this here. It passes through Syria and comes out on the Mediterranean.
Well, the one through Syria was not.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, you're right. We're talking about the Haifa one. This other one comes into the story later. Yeah, apologies. This one goes from Haifa on the coast of Israel. Yeah.
The one that goes to Haifa, that goes to what is now Anbar province in Iraq, through Jordan, and then to Israel, to Haifa. And back in 1934, that was all under the old British protectorate. And so the company that built it for Iraq was the old IPC organization, the Iraq Petroleum Company. And the Iraq Petroleum Company was owned by the current names are BP, Shell, ExxonMobil, and Total of France. So those companies, or IPC, had the full concession of oil production in Iraq. So they ran that pipeline in 1934. It supplied oil to the refineries in Haifa, and they in turn supplied finished products for the war effort. And that ran until 1948, when the king of Iraq stepped in, told IPC, you're not going to send your oil to this new country of Israel. And so IPC had to figure out a new route to the Mediterranean, and that's when, in 1952, they completed the pipeline to Banias, Syria. And that was a bigger pipeline than the one to Israel. It operated from 1952 until it was damaged during 1991 during the first Gulf War, but then in April of 2003, at the orders of Paul Wolfowitz, it was destroyed by the U.S. forces when we went into Iraq.
How would that have not damaged the potential Haifa pipeline route? Because I'm looking on this map, and by the way, I have kind of pipelines in the brain a bit, but I've interviewed Charlotte Dennett, and she has many of these same maps and talks about some of these same pipelines. And there's another one I think that isn't on here that she discusses that was relevant to around the time the Haifa pipeline was created, or the immediate post World War II era that does go through Lebanon, but that one doesn't seem to factor in here. But how would this, if you destroy this pump station in April 2003, how wouldn't that have, weren't they still interested in the Haifa pipeline? How would that have not damaged or was the idea just to prevent the reestablishment of oil going through there, and then you would eventually repair it if the Haifa pipeline were operative? Or do you understand what I'm asking? Like, how does that part work there?
Yeah, both pipelines go through that same node. That's correct. But they wanted to essentially shut down the export pipeline to Benias, and then Finance Minister Netanyahu went to London in June of 2003 looking for investment dollars. Now, the investment dollars would be to build a new pump station for a pipeline to Haifa, and to debottleneck the pipeline to Haifa was what he was after. Okay, so but in order to get any support behind a pipeline to Haifa, first they had to eliminate this pipeline to Syria. And the thing about the pipeline to Syria, I remember when, during our pre-war planning, we put together 8 policies that were approved by the principals, essentially the cabinet. And one of the principles that we agreed to was there would be no oil infrastructure intentionally bombed, attacked during hostilities, and that was all presented to the principals, the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, and I'm not sure who else is in that group. Larry would know better than I, but they all had signed off on the fact that there would be no intentional oil infrastructure attack. And then when we were just about ready to finalize our work in December, the gentleman on our team called us all together. Mike Mikowski is the gentleman's name, and he wanted us to reconsider that policy. He wanted us to make an exception that we go ahead and bomb that pipeline, eliminate it. And his argument was that Syria had been helping Saddam smuggle oil outside of the Oil for Food program, and therefore they needed to be punished. And I remember we were all sitting around the table when Mike presented his case.
Well, but Mark Rich and Glencore would not deserve to be punished. I would just put that for that transgression.
and Turkey and Jordan were also involved in some of the smuggling operations. So he left all that out of the presentation that he made. But that is it is. He, when he got finished with his presentation, I said, Mike, can I say a couple of things? He says, yeah. And I said, well, I hear you, but I said, your argument makes no sense to an oil guy. And he said, why is that? And I said, well, the pipeline is owned, constructed, and operated by the Iraqis. I said, the only thing that Syria gets is a toll fee for using their land and their area. So I said that you'd be punishing the future government of Iraq more than Syria. And he said, well, how much is that toll fee? And I said, well, I don't know. But I said in Saudi Arabia, when I was out there, we only paid 26 cents a barrel for crude oil that came across a much longer and much more expensive pipeline than this one. And I said, even if it's $1 a barrel, I said that's 4% of the punishment would go to Syria, and 96% would go to the future government of Iraq. And everyone in our meeting agreed with me. And so we essentially gave his request a thumbs down, but we agreed with him. We said, okay, we'll make the policy. And in fact, I got a copy of the slide in the book that said the pipeline will remain open or closed and used as leverage against government, the Syrian government. And and I thought at that point that the thing had gone to bed. And then about 4 days before I got on a plane to be deployed to Kuwait, Mike came up to me and said, Gary, you need to be in the conference room at 1 o'clock today for a conference. So I said, what's the subject? And he said, oil. And I said, who's there? And he said, well, Wolfowitz and General Franks. And I said, what do we, everything's been discussed many times. He says, no, they want to discuss this one more time. So we get up there and we spent probably 10 or 15 minutes talking the same old oil policies we had discussed. And then at the end of the meeting, Wolfowitz leans forward in his chair, gets a very serious look on his face, and he looks at General Franks, who was on a VTC out in Qatar at the time, and he said, General, I'll never forget this. I was sitting probably 4 or 5 feet away from Wolfowitz. He said, General, when you get into Iraq, I don't want another drop of oil to ever flow on that pipeline to Syria again. He says, do you understand me? And General Franks was on the other end. He gives him a sharp salute, said, I got the mission, sir. And then Wolfowitz says, okay, meeting dismissed. And he gets up and storms out of the meeting. And I sat there wondering, what the hell just happened? Well, I learned a few weeks later when General Bob Creer brought in the pictures of the destroyed pump station to me, what he meant by that order to General Franks.
Right. So, Larry Wilkerson, could you explain what this was, your recollection of these events? Were you aware of this kind of controversy and this oil angle at the time that you were there working for right under Secretary of State Powell? And I mean, shouldn't this idea of blowing up this pump against the actual plans and clearly for the benefit of well, I mean, the combination of that and the inquiries about the Haifa pipeline, I mean, this seems like this should be a scandal that these facts are coming out. I mean, what's your recollection of these oil angles from your time there, and why isn't this a bigger scandal?
Well, my biggest recollection, my most vivid recollection, is that everything that Gary just described in detail, Colin Powell knew absolutely nothing about the Secretary of the United States. But it doesn't surprise me one bit that the Deputy Secretary of Defense, without probably the Secretary of Defense's knowledge, issued such an order to the combatant commander, Tommy Franks, who, and let me make this very clear, I think was as dumb as he said Douglas Feith was. Only Douglas Feith wasn't really dumb. He was just scurrilous. Tommy Franks was, from the conversations that Powell had with him. Now, remember, Powell had been chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he had Norm Schwarzkopf to deal with during the first Gulf War, and he dealt with him beautifully, and Norm even admitted that afterwards. Franks was an idiot. He should never had 4 stars on. He should never have been a unified command commander. I could go into that in great detail, but I won't. And so what Gary just told me doesn't surprise me at all, especially the saluting smartly and going out and doing the mission. Not checking at all that any principal, let alone the President of the United States, or even Wolfowitz's boss, Donald Rumsfeld, knew that he'd given that order. That's the way this administration functioned. I go back to my students again. All these little power centers didn't pay any attention to the President of the United States nor the Principals Committee. They did what they wanted to do when they wanted to do it. And one of the things I'd like to get Gary to explore a little bit with you, if you're going to ask this question, just shut me up, is Scooter Libby was the lawyer for this arch criminal, Mark Rich. Now, Scooter Libby was also the chief of staff to the Vice President of the United States. It's my understanding from other sources that Scooter made about $4.5 million personally off his lawyering for this scoundrel, this crook. And we all know that in one of Bill Safire, I think, called it the most ignominious act of the presidency, Bill Clinton, in the last minute of his second administration, almost as he was walking out the door, pardoned Mark Rich. Now, why did Bill Clinton pardon Mark Rich? Probably in part, at least, if not large part, because Israel helped him beat H.W. Bush for the election that made him president the first time in 92, 93. So this is a whole potpourri of scoundrels who are personally profiting, who are doing what they want to do, are doing some really scurrilous things. And I wrote this down today just so I could say this again and again and again every time I get on. According to the Cost of War Project at Brown University, which I've found to be pretty reputable in terms of their analyses, in the last 20 years, and Iraq is right in the middle of this, the preeminent case, the United States of America has displaced or killed over 45 million people. It's killed directly or indirectly 4.5 million. It's displaced internally or externally, which means they have no home. They're either outside their own borders or inside their own borders without a home. 38 million. And in the process of doing that, it spent $1 trillion taxpayer dollars per year for a total of $21 trillion. And this doesn't even include the massive number of veterans we've created and the VA budget, which used to be $40 billion and now is $340 billion and climbing. This is an incredible thing that the United States has done. It's why the new foreign minister of China said yesterday that the United States has a policy of sanction, of cruelty, of commitment to wars. And if it doesn't get off that track, it is going to derail itself. This is the new foreign minister of China. This is some pretty powerful language now coming out of the other competitor in the world, which is surpassing us in almost every category of real national power. And what are we doing? We're buried in Ukraine. We're buried in Gaza. We're buried in more of what I just described. And these criminals within our government are the people who are doing this. And Mark Rich and Scooter Libby are a perfect example. And I'll just add one other point. I read Valerie Plame's book, Fair Game. The other night, I stumbled on Amazon Prime's movie, where Sean Penn plays her husband, Ambassador Joe Wilson, and just does a marvelous job. And I started talking to Valerie about it to see just how valid the movie was. And this is another thing that Scooter Libby did. Scooter Libby exposed a non-official covert operative for the CIA. And Karl Rove, that wonderful man advising that neophyte, President Bush, is the one who coined that phrase. You know, when he was told that this was an illegal thing to do, he said, no, she's fair game. She's fair game. That's where the title came from. This is an administration, 8 years of complete and utter corruption that makes previous administrations, which have been corrupt too at times, look like playboys.
Gary Vogler, do you have any last words? And where's the best place for people to get your book? Because it's really people, you have to read it. People have to read it. It's extremely useful.
It's on Amazon, and you could get it. It's being sold on Amazon right now. But if you know me, I'll sign a copy for you. Larry's got a signed copy from me. It's out there. It's been out there since May. And then go ahead.
Gary just sent me a box load. I'm going to take them down to the conference in Washington and put them on the table for books.
Yeah. I mean, it's punchy. It's like the whole thing. It's short, but there's nothing in it that's filler. I've never really summarized most of a whole book before on podcasts, so I really recommend it. And I thank you both for staying over time here. It's been a really illuminating conversation. I will try to recommend your book to other people who have podcasts so you can promote it, Gary, because I think people really need to read it. But thank you, gentlemen, both so much for being here today.
Thank you, Aaron. Yeah.
Take care of yourself, Gary.
All right. You too, Larry.
You can watch the rest of this episode by subscribing to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. There you will find the best coverage and analysis of the deep politics of the U.S. empire. The URL is patreon.com/American Exception. It's also in the show notes, and if you can afford it, we really appreciate it if you could subscribe. You can also find in the show notes a link to purchase Gary Vogler's excellent book, Israel, Winner of the 2003 Iraq Oil War. Thanks to Dana Chavarria for producing this episode, and thank you for tuning in. I really enjoyed speaking with these gentlemen today. On the one hand, they have very different political views from me, I think, and backgrounds too. That said, I think it adds more weight to their revelations and analysis. They were not radical persons at all before their experiences of the long Iraq War. I'm struck by how their disillusionment was a process that unfolded over many years as they tried to make sense of what they had experienced and been a part of. Thankfully, they have the courage to inform the public of what they experienced and learned in their time on the devil's chessboard.